Gotta have fun when you can, you know? Exactly. It is. Thanks for joining the stream. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. So last lecture today, going out with a bang, talking about the rule following paradox. Maybe before we get started, a few things just about organization. So one thing to note is we don't have to. Hey, come on in. I am supposed to give you time to answer the whatever the hell it's called, the survey from the course during the lecture. Do people actually want time to do that during the lecture, or would you rather go home instead? Yeah, shocking, really. I like that better too. First things first, we won't do that. Bad thing to have done that after the recording started, but whatever. Hi. The second thing is how we do want to run our session. I suspect, all told, we've got maybe about an hour to get through content-wise. So let's try and just power through it and see how it goes. Whether we have more or less will kind of depend on how discussion goes and how we pick up the paradox and things like this. My suggestion is we try and just power through and aim to end a little bit early. Is that okay with everyone? And obviously, again, if you need to use the bathroom or take a break or anything, it's no problem. Just don't have to ask. So this is a terrifying image that I found online, searching for Kripkenstein. It is a combination of Kripke and Wittgenstein with some bolts in the neck as well for the Kripkenstein effect. Yeah, creepy. It's a little bit behind the times. This would have been a good topic and a good picture for Halloween, but we do what we can. So what I want to do is start off by first talking about the paradox, what it is, how it's structured, how Kripke presents it, and why it's a problem. And then I want to talk through four possible responses. Really 5, but 2 of them are effectively the same, and they're so bad that we can just quickly dismiss them. So we'll talk about uses or potential responses that appeal to past use in something like an algorithm. That'll be done very quickly. Then we'll spend a bit of time talking about dispositional responses, because these tend to be the ones that people put forward. It's the one that Kripke talked the most about in the reading. Then we'll talk a little bit about a kind of machine-based response, and finally a simplicity response. And once we go through those, I'll say a few things about the overall course structure, and then we can all go home happy. Sounds good? Okay. Before we get properly going, how many people did the reading? Wow, that's pretty good. I'm pleased. So, honest to God, go read this. The PDF, the shortened version, it's really digestible. This is a really cool puzzle. I know I say this pretty much every time. That's because I do really enjoy all of these. This one's really fun. And there's a reason I kind of wanted to go out on this one. I think it's an interesting puzzle, potentially massive implications, massive applications. So, what is the puzzle? So maybe a thing to note is what exactly we're going to talk about. I've got the book. I love this book. This is, I think, my 3rd copy of this, because I've destroyed my previous 2 through overuse. So Kripke's aim in this book, and it's a super short book, is to spell out an argument that is kind of the central or one of the central planks in Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations. And this is so-called the private language argument. Have you guys heard of Wittgenstein or talked much about him before in other classes? Maybe in history of analytic or some other stuff? So Wittgenstein, basically, there's kind of 2 of him, effectively. There's an early Wittgenstein who really tried to perfect the project that Frege and Russell were doing. This idea about let's have a perfect formal language, let's just try and do everything with that. Basically, this is what his Tractatus was trying to do. It falls apart. Doesn't work. There are things that it just simply can't do. So then you get the later Wittgenstein, which came much later, and he kind of blows the whole thing up. And in fact, what exactly is going on in philosophical investigations is way beyond my pay grade. But one of the big lessons is this purported private language argument. And as Kripke understands it, it's basically an argument that there can be no such thing as meaning. So Kripke opens the book by saying, quoting Wittgenstein from Philosophical Investigations, "This was our paradox. No course of action could be determined by a rule because every course of action can be made out to accord with the rule. Effectively, every time you think you're following a rule, there's an infinite number of different ones you could be following." That's the paradox in a nutshell. We're going to try and show that. But again, Kripke's aim here isn't necessarily to say, oh, this is what Wittgenstein meant, or even really what Kripke wants to think, or what he believes about meaning. He jokingly puts it, this is Wittgenstein's argument as it struck Kripke, as it presented a problem for him. So you'll sometimes get this stuff talked about as Kripkenstein. And that is the picture that I Googled, that is what I Googled to find this horrific image. Right? Again, a kind of combination of Frankenstein's monster, of Kripke, the late Wittgenstein, and in this case, some bolts through the neck. So again, that's going to be the paradox. This is sort of, we can't follow a rule. So Kripke argues for this using a mathematical example. And notably, he uses a mathematical example because that eliminates a bunch of noise that might come up about the paradox. But it doesn't have to be about maths. That just makes it easier. In fact, all we need is any kind of behavior that purports to or attempts to be following a kind of rule. So importantly, one of the things that will fall in here is language use or meaning. If we think that meaning is something like rule following, that is, whenever you use a word, there's something like a linguistic rule behind it, then all of the problems we're going to raise apply to language use too. Again, we're going to use a mathematical example, but that's an example. Doesn't have to do with maths. And we can start off by defining two mathematical functions. Just for the initial ease, we'll express them using different operators, just so we can kind of be introduced to them. So first we have plus, and we'll express this with the kind of usual plus sign. And then Kripke introduces us to the quos function. So quos is very similar to plus, but it behaves ever so slightly differently. Right? So we'll define plus and addition, which is the function of using plus, in the standard way. And we'll define quaddition, which is very much like addition, but uses the quos function, as very similar to addition, but with one divergence. So if, when we quad x and y, right, when we use the quos function to do some quaddition, if x and y are both smaller than 57, then just take their sum. Take the normal result from addition. So 56 plus 56, that's something we would get the same result as with addition. 57 and 57, we get the same result. But as soon as we have one number that's bigger than 57, even one of the two, well then quaddition tells us to go to 5. So if you have, say, 59 plus 58, and it's actually quos, you get 5. So quaddition basically looks like addition up to a point, and then it does something kind of funny. Okay, so that's just a kind of stipulative definition. And note, the fact that we use 57 here isn't really important. We just picked a number. So here's the problem. Imagine that you've been, you're back in grade school. Basically, let's imagine one of many people's nightmares. You have to go back and you have to pass all of your grade school exams. You haven't studied. And in fact, in grade school, what you never did was you never added any numbers greater than 57. As it happens in the classroom, every number you used was always smaller than that. So as you're doing the addition, you think you're doing the addition function. But are you sure you're doing the addition function? Are you not sure that you're doing quaddition? That is, every time you use the plus symbol, did you mean plus or did you mean quas? If we already get that problem, we've already got the start of the paradox. But again, note, this particular number we picked is just arbitrary. If you don't like that number, go bigger. Right? Just imagine any number that's bigger than any one you've ever added before, and take that instead of 57. That's all we really need. So here's a skeptical question. In the past, when you wrote down the plus sign, or you used it, or you spoke it, or you answered it in reply to a teacher's question, did you mean plus or did you mean quas? And the problem is any evidence you might cite that you meant plus in the past is going to be consistent with your meaning quas. Every bit of information that you can cite that you think is going to give you, oh, I meant this function, is going to be just as compatible with your meaning this function. So let's think about behavior. Well, behavior isn't going to help because by stipulation, this isn't something you've done before. Again, if you don't like 57, use a bigger number. No matter how many computations you've done previously, you ain't never done one with 57. So all of your previous acts of using this symbol are perfectly compatible with you meaning, to go back a slide, either regular old addition or this weird new function. So your behavior is going to be compatible with both of those rules. In fact, not just these two. In fact, there'll be an infinite number of functions that your behavior is perfectly compatible with. Kripke points this out in a really lovely way. I remember hating these kinds of questions way back when I was doing SAT prep stuff. But you get one of these kind of questions where it's like, oh, here's the sequence, 2, 4, 6, 8. What's the next number in the sequence? As Kripke says, an intelligence tester may suppose that there's only one possible continuation. Mathematical and philosophical sophisticates know that an infinite number of rules apply. This is compatible with any finite initial string. The next answer could be anything you want. Because we effectively have underdetermination. Right? Again, everyone's done philosophy of science, right? So this is basically the underdetermination of the theory by data. Right? In this case, whatever behavior you have doesn't tell you exactly what rule it's using. So your past behavior isn't going to suffice to say, oh, I definitely meant plus instead of quas. Maybe there's something internal. Well, the internal stuff isn't going to help either. Because your internal setup is going to look the exact same for all of the cases you actually dealt with. Because what you're doing on the inside is presumably just some kind of operations. And those operations are going to look the exact same up until the two branch. So, as Kripke puts it, even if God were to look into my mind, he or she still couldn't determine that I meant addition by plus. By using this symbol, there's no fact of the matter, it looks like. So behavior doesn't do it, internal stuff doesn't do it. Now, here's the first thing to note. We talked about in the past just to kind of help us get this going. It doesn't have to be about in the past. It can be about what you mean now, too. This was, again, a handy way for us to get the problem going. It's not essential to the problem. So the skeptical conclusion, no external stuff helps. No internal stuff helps. Hey, no internal or external stuff helps. So there is no fact of the matter. Nothing is going to settle this. Nothing justifies my meaning plus rather than quas. Now we're in the past. So again, to quote from the Kripke, right? It says, was there some past fact about me, what I meant by plus, that mandates what I should do now? When asked for the answer to 68, that sign 57, I unhesitantly and automatically produced 125. But it would seem that if previously I never performed this computation explicitly, I might just as well have answered 5. Nothing justifies a brute inclination to answer one way rather than another. Again, everything we've done up until that point is compatible with continuing the process either by going to 5 or going to 125. The past doesn't settle this question. And here's the real kicker. Again, that was all just a potential example talking about this silly case. The problem is this generalizes. There's not going to be any way to follow rules at all. Because every time you think that you're following some rule, well, you might in fact be following a different one. And that's a problem because presumably linguistic meaning is something very much like a rule. Use this if you want to mean that. That's a problem. Because that looks like a rule, and that looks like we're going to be able to churn it through this problem again. As Kripke puts it, ultimately, if the skeptic's right, the concepts of meaning and of intending one function rather than another will make no sense. But the skeptic holds that no fact about my past history, nothing that was ever in my mind or in my external behavior, establishes that I meant plus rather than quas. If this is correct, there can of course be no fact about which particular function I meant. In other words, there's no way to have meaning. It all goes. And that's weird. There's no following rules. There's no way to mean anything when you use language. As Kripke puts it, and I love this, as he kind of wraps up presenting the problem, he says, sometimes when I've contemplated the situation, I've had something like an eerie feeling. It's like, look, I know that this stuff works, but I do not know how to get out of it. I do not know what to do here. So, before we go on, pause and ask, first, does the paradox make sense? Do we see the structure? Again, yeah.
Yeah, so the quas is just any dummy that holds for the data, but is a different operator.
Yes. It's a different function. Again, yeah. And this is an example, right? It's a silly example. So the idea is, imagine you just never added a number bigger than this. Every time you thought you were using addition beforehand, you might have just as well been doing quaddition. And again, if you don't like this, there are other examples. In fact, I think I've got it on a few slides later. A parallel, really fun case is an instance about the offside rule that happened in the 2010 World Cup. So it was a game with Mexico and South Africa. And Mexico has a corner. I don't know if many people are invested in football or anything. Mexico has a corner. And the South African goalie comes up. And then there's a Mexican player behind the goalkeeper. Now, importantly, this all happens after the ball gets tipped forward. And the commentators who are watching it say, oh, he can't be offside because there's a South African defender on the goal line. The problem is, that's not how the offside rule works. A lot of people think there's an exception if it's the goalie. And in fact, what was really interesting is that the two experts who were watching it had interpreted every occurrence of offsides in correspondence with this one that makes an exception for the goalkeeper. But they were just wrong. They were using effectively offside star rather than offside, and they didn't even know it up until this one case came through. So I couldn't find the one clip where the two guys are talking about it and they're just totally wrong, but this is a nice one where the one guy initially is just like, how in the world, and then the other guy explains it to him on air. But it's a really nice case, because it's, again, an instance where you have a whole bunch of people all think they're obeying the same rule, all think that things are working a certain way, and then a split case occurs.
And so the pragmatism of rules or meaning does not immediately imply that it's true. Is that how you can phrase it?
Tell me more. I'm not quite sure what you mean by
so
fragment.
The fact that it works does not mean that it's true.
Yeah, basically, because in any case, you're going to have an infinite number of different applicable rules. So the thought is, anytime, and this is, again, to go back a few slides, when we're thinking about the kind of intelligence tester case, this is actually a really handy way to come at it. Whenever you have a finite collection of behavior, there's going to be an infinite number of rules that will apply and satisfy and describe. That's effectively the problem. Better. That's the first part of the problem. So there's an infinite number of rules. The second part of the problem is there's not going to be anything you can turn to that tells you exactly which one it is you're using rather than another. So there are an infinite number, and nothing you can appeal to justifies saying that you're using this one rather than any of these others. That's the big trick. Again, this sort of underdetermination coupled with lack of justification. That's the paradox. So, again, one of the upshots here is that it looks like there can't be any meaning whatsoever. Because meaning seems to be rule-like, and there are no ways to obey rules fully. That's bad. To get very clear, this problem is not about anything like skepticism about mathematics or mathematical functions, right? This is one of the reasons why we use quos and plus, because both of these are perfectly legitimate mathematical functions. There's nothing wrong with these two. It's not one's degenerate or something like that. These are both perfectly good. And again, it doesn't really matter that we use this mathematical example. It's just a neat and handy and very clear way to set it up. This is a skepticism about meaning rather than maths. How do we know which of these two perfectly legitimate functions is or was attached to our previous uses of the symbol? There doesn't seem to be any way to settle it. And again, we can talk about the offside rule. That will be perfectly consistent with previous behaviors. Every time the linesman did this, right? Again, that's perfectly consistent with a lot of different rules. In this case, there were even two that remain explicit. So the skeptical challenge effectively has two parts. The first is there any fact, any external or internal fact that I meant plus rather than quas, as Kripke puts it? In what did my meaning plus rather than quas consist? Because it feels like we did mean plus. We meant addition rather than quaddition. So what's the fact there? What is it that we can appeal to? And the second one is, do I now have any reason to be confident that I should answer 125 rather than 5 when someone asks me, hey, what's 68 plus sine 57? So note, there's two different questions here. Our first one is there anything that definitely explains what our past meanings were? That we meant one rather than the other? And the second one is there something that justifies my preferring one answer rather than the other? Why should I say 125? Even though that is the one that I'm inclined to say, why is that the right answer? What's the justification for thinking that's correct? So, we say, the problem is not how do I know that 68 plus 57 is 125? That could be answered giving an arithmetical computation. But rather, how do I know that 68 plus 57, as I mean plus in the past, should denote 125? If the word plus, as I used it in the past, denoted the quest function, not the plus function, then my past intention was such that I should have replied 5. Even my past intentions aren't sufficient to tell me which of the two that I was using. Again, do we get a feel for the paradox? Do we kind of have a grip on it? Are there questions on it? Because if we don't get the paradox, the rest of this is going to be real boring. Because obviously what we're going to try and do now is come up with some solutions to it, some responses. So maybe before we jump straight into thinking about responses, just ask, what are people's gut reactions? Yeah.
But I'm struggling with the fact that you use plus because that's what you've been taught.
So here's the funny thing, right? Everything we've been taught is also perfectly compatible with quas.
Okay.
So again, what we can do is now, instead of defining it in terms of 57, let's define it in terms of the biggest number anyone was ever taught how to add. We've got the same problem.
So his point is that we all could be wrong.
That's one issue. Right? Or, again, what we could all be doing is each one of us is running on a different function. And we just haven't hit breakpoints yet. Because we haven't gotten to a big enough number. Or we haven't come across the offside case we disagree on. Again, the particular example of using plus and quas doesn't matter that we use 57, doesn't matter that we use this addition versus quaddition. That's just a really nice, very clear and distinct function we can define. If you don't like this, think of if it's less than the biggest number anyone's ever added, ever. And then let's think about what happens next.
So the problem then is that we all could be wrong, and we all could be operating on different rules.
Yeah.
Okay.
Again, more the latter than the former. More than that we could be operating with different rules than we could be wrong. Because if we think about we could be wrong, in some sense, we'd already need to be able to lock onto a rule. But we'll come back to something like this in just a few slides. Okay. Other questions, comments? Again, what do we think? What's the kind of gut reaction? Maybe better. Do we think it's a problem? And if so, how bad? Yeah.
Okay. Can you maybe give another example, but through language? Because I understand the mathematical operation of quas, but how does this apply to words? Because after all, it is a semantic issue.
Sure.
I think.
So we might, we might do this with kind of everyday words. And in some sense, we even set it up as a mathematical one, but it's really about how we use the word plus, or we use that symbol. In that sense, it already is about language. But a cheap example is with the word chair. Right? We might have a kind of broad agreement on something like a characteristic definition of chair, and then we wheel out a new example, and half the class is like, yep, and half the class is like, no. And up until that point, we all thought we were using the term in the same way. That's a cheap example.
Yeah.
But I think that, again, drives the point. We keep going. We think we're all using it in the same way, and then we hit a divergent point. And note, we could keep fragmenting.
Thanks.
No problem. It's a good question. Okay. So yeah, what do we think? Problem? How bad a problem? If we think it's a problem. So again, I love this puzzle. It's very, yeah, go ahead.
I don't think it's that big of a problem, because if every time you hit the point, you specify a rule, you come closer to a universal rule.
I like this idea. Here's the problem. No matter how many times we try and persistify, there's always going to be another infinite number of possible candidates that we still have to deal with. Because no matter how long we sit here and keep adding, just to use the addition example, there's always going to be bigger stuff. And no matter how hard we work, our finite number of operations are always going to pale in comparison to the infinite number of possible applications of the rule.
And then for rules about language, if you're talking about the chair, like we all kind of know what a chair is, and then you have an example like, I don't know.
Yeah.
But then you talk about it, you figure it out, and then I don't see how that could be a very big problem.
So maybe the chair one is a kind of funny one, because there might be something like a finite number of chairs available. But of course, what we could play around with is the infinite number of sentences featuring the word chair. And it might be that, in fact, there's a bunch of sentences that we never use, nobody ever says, but that we would, were we presented with them, would go yay or nay, and hence have the fragmentation, even if we're not given the object. We disagree about the use of the term. Does that kind of scratch the itch there?
A little bit.
So one of the things that's lurking in the background here, if we move to worries about language, is there's an infinite number of unuttered sentences. And these unuttered sentences better behave according to grammatical rule. Oh shit. Grammatical rules. Semantic rules. So that's going to do a lot of heavy lifting for us too. Even if there's finite numbers of concrete examples, we can talk about an infinite number of non-concrete examples. That's going to be the problem. Okay. Cool. But I like the thing. I mean, here's a cheap response, and one of the reasons why I really love this puzzle. This has to be wrong. And this has to be wrong because we're talking about it right now. Like, you could understand me when I presented the paradox. We talked about it. We figured out what exactly the problem is. So there has to be something like meaning. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been able to do that. But we still have a joy, which is figuring out what's doing it. Where's the justification coming? There has to be some meaning facts. Otherwise, we couldn't have even gotten this problem going. Again, it's a kind of fun problem, right? We still don't know what it is that justifies things. This normative problem is still big. And this fact problem is still a hard one too. We don't have answers, but we know there has to be one. That's at least my gut reaction there. Again, I don't have a good story to tell you about where they come from or what the normative answer is, but I feel like there has to be an answer. Otherwise, we might as well have just been whistling. So let's talk about some potential answers, right? Some potential replies. Just to spoil them now, they all kind of suck. Shocking. Right? So our first two, we're just going to present them and immediately discard them, but it doesn't hurt to see them. Our first one is one that even the puzzle is set up to treat, but again, it's handy to talk about. You might appeal to past use. Right? So again, what we're trying to think of here is to go back to look at the second, or the first and second one. Right? The first challenge is, again, what does the fact that I meant plus rather than quas consistent? Sorry, that should be quas rather than plus. Right? So what's the fact consistent? Well, here's the first option. The fact that I meant addition consists of the fact that I use plus as a symbol for addition. Right? My behavior was consistent with doing so. My intention was to do so. But again, this is basically just reformulating the problem. I've only ever done a finite amount of computations, so my intentions and behavior aren't going to be sufficient to guarantee or justify that I meant addition rather than quaddition or anything else. And similarly, we might think, oh, look, my behavior has been structured according to something like an algorithm. So the fact that I meant addition rather than quaddition consists of the fact that I adopted a specific rule. And this has the ring of solving the problem. But as Wittgenstein and Kripke both note, this basically appeals to something like a rule for interpreting a rule. And in turn, this meta rule we can run the skeptical hypothesis on. Because the meta rule will be compatible with lots and lots of different interpretations of it. And hence, it will be underdetermined, and hence we can run the skeptical conclusion against it. So, appealing to some underlying algorithmic story just gives us more grist to the mill. That doesn't help, because anytime you use a rule, I run a new version of the argument against that meta rule. And the kind of related one that Kripke briefly talks about, and he talks more about it in one of the lengthy footnotes, is this doesn't look like a good response for individuals, especially if you think there's something like in your head that's doing the job. Because most people don't know or can't express anything like an algorithm undergirding their usage of a term. A cheap example, again, to come back to chair, is pretty much everybody knows what a chair is. We know how to use the term. We all are broadly in agreement. Who the hell can understand or provide a rule for when we should use the word chair? Both grammatical and something like the truth conditions for the term. Good fucking luck. Right? You're not going to come up with a good definition here. Or another one is sandwich, right? Everyone's had this debate. Is a hot dog a sandwich? Is a burrito? These are heavy, heavy metaphysical debates. So these two, these are not going to do it for us, right? These are basically just running right back into the machinery of the paradox. So a more plausible response, and this is the one almost universally adopted as a response, is a kind of dispositional account. Are people familiar with dispositions? Has this sort of notion come up before? Have people come across this notion? So dispositions are effectively like being inclined to do something. So typical examples are like a glass is disposed to shatter if struck. So even if it doesn't in fact get struck and shatter, it still has that property. Right? Or sugar cubes, right? A cube of sugar is disposed to dissolve if I drop it in my tea. That will be the case even if we like shatter it with a hammer. So dispositions are basically kind of properties things can have where they're inclined to do something, and they can have these inclinations even if they're not acted on. Well-designed buildings are disposed to sway gently in earthquakes. That will be true even if the building gets torn down before it ever gets hit by an earthquake. So what we might think is that what explains the job, the underlying fact, is a disposition. And the disposition is when confronted with x plus symbol y, we're disposed to respond with their sum. That is, to use addition rather than quaddition. We want their sum rather than their quam, to make a bad pun. So the thought is, like, even if I've never in fact encountered 68 plus sine 57, that is, never done any of the applications bigger than that number, I have the disposition to give the right answer. In the same way that a building might be disposed to sway even if it's never hit with an earthquake, or a glass is disposed to shatter if dropped even if it never actually gets dropped. Even if, let's say, it's little existence, we make it, we let it cool, and then we melt it back down. That thing was still disposed to shatter if dropped. So this dispositional story looks plausible, but there are a number of problems. First one has to do with potential mistakes. Now note, this isn't that we're necessarily wrong about the rule, but it's that we can screw up following the rules. So everyone's disposed, at least in some cases. Obviously, I'm not disposed to make typos at all, right? That's meant to be cases. Everyone's disposed, at least in some cases, to make mistakes. Some people are just really bad at arithmetic. Some people can be really good at arithmetic, but still occasionally make a mistake. They forget to carry one or something like this. So in those cases, our dispositional person has an issue. They either have to say that in the cases where they're disposed to make a mistake, they aren't disposed to mean addition after all. They're disposed to mean some other function that delivers this answer, delivers the incorrect answer, or the disposition alone isn't enough to do it. The disposition isn't doing the work. It's something else. Do we see the dilemma there? It's a beautiful little dilemma. Because again, the problem to resolve is what explains or what is the fact that we mean addition rather than some other function? Answer, our dispositions. Problem, our dispositions sometimes take us to answers that don't comport with meaning addition. So either we were not disposed to do addition in the first place, or it ain't the disposition alone that's doing the heavy lifting. It's something else. It's something like a correctness condition. Again, do we see the two horns of the dilemma here? It is beautiful. So that's our first problem with this dispositional solution. People can make mistakes, and in light of these mistakes, it's not really clear how this is actually going to do the job. There's two more problems. The second problem is what we might call a kind of finitude problem. Kripke says, look, not only my actual performance, but also the totality of my dispositions is finite. So the thought here is, look, even if I've only ever done this many addition problems, some finite amount of actual addition cases, that's one thing. It's also the case, because I'm a finite being, that my dispositions kind of run out after a certain point too. I don't have any dispositions about how to respond with some really fucking huge numbers, I can't even process them. By the time that you said it, I'd be dead. If it's that big a number, then I don't have a disposition to respond. I have a disposition to die before you finish the number. So our dispositions only go for finite numbers of cases. It doesn't cover these really crazy infinite applications. So again, these dispositions don't cut it. And the last one is a really interesting one. So the last problem says, look, even if you think this is what the fact consists of, even if you think this is a good answer to the first kind of question, this does not give you a justification. This doesn't answer the second skeptical question. At best, the dispositionalist gives us a descriptive account. But remember, the second question was what justifies my answering 125 rather than 5. We want a normative answer. And the disposition does not give us a normative answer. So to highlight what I mean, I'm going to go back a few slides again. The skeptical challenge, as we said, has 2 parts. The first part is, what does the fact consist of? The dispositionalist says, it's a disposition. The second one is, why should I have this thing rather than that thing? Why should I respond 125 rather than 5? And if the answer is, that's what you're disposed to do, we don't have a normative answer. We just have something like a description. But I want to know why I'm justified in doing that, not just why I do. Do we see the force there? It's a really subtle little move. So cool, we can maybe say why, because I'm justified. But I want to know, is that the right move? Should I be doing that? And just saying I'm disposed to, well, cool, I knew that already, thanks. That's not answering my question. So that's the kind of normativity problem. If we want a normative response, a justification, dispositions aren't going to do it. Or at least they don't seem to. Okay, so that's a kind of individual dispositionalist solution. We can look for individuals. We might generalize it out. And in fact, this is a very plausible way. Arguably, the next position was Wittgenstein's own solution to this problem. And this is something like a kind of community-wide disposition. So instead of looking into each one of us and thinking about what we're all disposed to do, we look at what our linguistic community is disposed to do. So the fact that I meant addition rather than quaddition, or plus rather than quas, consists in the fact that most or all of the members of my linguistic community were disposed, when presented with x plus sign y, to respond with the sum rather than the quum. That is, most of the people in my linguistic community are disposed to use addition rather than quaddition. And the nice move here is by pushing it out into the kind of community, then individuals can make mistakes, right? They just fail to match up with the broad disposition that almost everybody has. So we avoid that at least initial problem. But of course, that's fine, but the community might all have a problem. Everybody in the group might be really crap at doing addition. So we could all be making kind of persistent errors and not know it. So we run a version of the argument. And the other 2 objections apply again just as badly. Let's have everybody in the community start doing some addition. Cool. No matter what, there's always going to be numbers bigger than we get to. And again, if we thought that normativity objection was a problem before, it is still a problem here. So local dispositions don't help. Community dispositions don't seem to help. One last broadly dispositionalist move. we might have a kind of what's sometimes jokingly called the perfect calculator disposition. So the fact that I'm disposed, or the fact that I intended to mean plus rather than quas consists of the fact that were I free from mistakes, I would have been disposed, when presented with x plus sin y, to respond with their sum rather than their quad. That is, if it wasn't like my meatbag brain kind of going wrong or me misunderstanding things or something like this, I would have given the right answer. You're looking confused.
Yeah, I just, you're not free from mistakes, so.
Yeah, it's not very helpful. One of Kripke's responses to this is just blatant science fiction. Right? But we can even spot them that. It's still very clear that this isn't a good answer, even if it wasn't science fiction. Because in order to make this correct, to say I'm free from mistakes, you have to know which rule you're supposed to be using. And that is exactly what's at issue. You can't know that you're not making a mistake unless you already know which rule you're using. But you have to know which rule you're using. That's what we're trying to figure out. Which rule are you using? So you need to know which rule in order to know which rule, which is cool, but not very helpful in response to a skeptical challenge. You would need to know that answering with 5 was a mistake, but that's exactly what we're trying to figure out. So this doesn't help. This basically just says, I know the rule because I know the rule. Which, do you? So again, we have this localized disposition. That seems to run into problems. We have this community-wide disposition, which dodges at least the first version of a problem, but then walks into 3 new ones, or at least 3 versions of ones we knew. And we have this kind of, oh, if I was perfect version, which at least avoids the error, but does so by begging the question. Not so good. Okay, before we get to the last couple, again, pause, ask, what questions do you have for me so far? Are we feeling okay? So there's 2 more kinds of responses, so there's not a whole lot more left. But again, what's important is we got to kind of feel for why these ones don't work, why these dispositional moves don't work. So the next one kind of extends or pushes the dispositionalist stuff a little bit further. And these are sometimes called machine solutions. And the thought here is that the fact that I meant addition rather than quaddition, or plus rather than quas, consists of something we can encode or embody in some kind of mechanism or machine. And this basically breaks down into 2 kinds of stories. There's one version where we locate this in a physical machine. The fact is going to consist of some physical machine, some calculating object, some entity. Maybe a really weird one would be some kind of chemical process going on in our brain. Or we might have a literal like cog and gear kind of calculator ticking away or whatever. The thought is, all right, the physical machine story. We have an object, a thing. Again, a biochemical one, a mechanical one, a digital one. We don't really care. Right? And it embodies the addition function. Just in case, when it gives 2 numbers as input, it outputs their sum rather than their quam. Again, right? It behaves according to the addition function rather than the quaddition function. So we can externalize it. Maybe that's what the solution is. This doesn't help. This is just locating the dispositionalist response in some external object. Or maybe some biochemical mechanism in our brain. Cool, we just run all of the objections we had before on this physical machine. No help. Alternatively, if you didn't mean physical machine, if you meant something like a program, and the machine is just an instance of it, or an embodiment of this program, cool, right? Well, then we dodge things about maybe finitude or mistakes or something like this. But that's just because all you're talking about is an algorithm. And that's what the whole fucking problem is about, my dude. Which algorithm are you using? Oh, don't know. Can't tell. If you could tell, then you'd already have known. But we've got the argument to show you can't tell. So, cool. You're either begging the question, in which case, no answer, or you're just appealing to something like external states, which again is going to be compatible with an infinite number of different algorithms. No help, my dude. So this externalization, not very helpful. Okay. And our last solution kind of moves away from dispositions or externalization and actually just thinks about the functions themselves. So some of this should be ringing alarm bells for you guys. In philosophy of science, did you talk about the new riddle of induction with Grew and Nelson Goodman? This at all, I'm going to take that as a no. Everybody familiar with the riddle of induction, right? Hume, basically, the past facts don't guarantee that future behavior is going to be that way. So Goodman comes along in the 60s, and he says, hey, here's an even worse problem. If you use the word green to talk about emeralds, your use of the word green for emeralds is compatible with two different ways to understand that. Could mean green now and forever, or it could mean green now up until, let's say, I don't know, January 31st, 2023, and blue afterwards. So which one do you mean when you use green? Problem. All prior uses are going to be compatible with both. And now we can run new versions of the paradox, or new versions of this problem of induction, not even about, going from past facts to future ones. We're not sure what the past facts actually say. Are they giving us info about Grew, or are they giving us info about green? Don't know. What we're talking about here isn't terribly far off. Now, one favorable and often taken response to the new riddle of induction is green is simpler. Right? The standard understanding of green is green now and forever, versus the disjunctive understanding of Grew, which is green up until January 31st and blue afterwards. This is conjunctive, the way I set it up, but you see. So it's logically more complex. So I prefer one versus the other because one of them is simpler. So along similar lines, we might respond to the skeptic by saying, okay, look, what guarantees or the fact that I meant addition is part by disposition and partially because when it's indeterminate which rule we mean, you favor the simpler one. And addition is a simpler function. Because remember, quas was kind of disjunctive. It behaves like normal up until the numbers are 57, and then it goes weird after. So it's kind of parallel to the Grew case. We favor green because green is simpler. We favor addition because addition is a simpler function. So there's two kinds of problems with this. There are basic problems, I put these in scare quotes, because these are problems that you generally have when you use notions of simplicity. Simplicity is relative, it's very hard to define, There are going to be plausible cases where people will invert the simplicity. We could define addition in terms of quaddition, and then addition turns out to be more complex. But the more interesting objection to this kind of simplicity thing is that it just simply doesn't do the job. It's the wrong kind of answer. If we think about what it is that we're doing in our heads when we justify answering 125 rather than 5, it's not because 125 is somehow a kind of simpler function or the product of a simpler function. That just does not seem to enter into the decision here. Whatever kind of answer we're going to appeal to, hypothetical simplicity just doesn't seem to be along the right kind of lines. No, these kind of go hand in hand. The first one's basically like, look, you can't get this to work. And the second one says, even if you could get it to work, it doesn't answer the question. It answers a different question. It certainly doesn't give you anything like good justification for why this is a better answer than the other one. Yeah.
Could you also phrase the basic problem as we human beings are more disposed to this kind of simple explanation?
Yeah. I mean, in some sense, that's kind of what the move is, and then the problem with the basic problems is just like, well, look, our inclinations towards certain forms of simplicity, that doesn't necessarily mean the world goes that way, my dude. Or even that we might be inclined to it when we're giving our own explanations, but that doesn't necessarily track with how we actually behave. We like to think of ourselves as safe, sane, and sensible, but maybe we're much more chaotic than we thought. That's a heavy-handed way to put it, but yeah. So, what do we basically get, right? What we get is a bunch of attempts, and again, these are all taken from the Kripke. They're not really taken from external literature, but we have a bunch of attempted solutions, all that fall down in various hurdles. They either don't answer the first one of actually giving us a good story about what the fact consists in, or they just don't give a kind of normative answer. And we need both. And in fact, it's really hard to see what could do the job. Whatever it is, needs to be able to, again, tell us the kind of why are past uses of plus actually tracking addition rather than quaddition? What does it consist in? And then why should we answer with 125 rather than 5? Why should we use plus to favor this rather than that? So, to kind of wrap up, Kripkenstein's paradox, I think, is a prima facie pretty big problem, right? It's weird. We feel like we should be able to follow rules. I mean, my God, my mother drilled that into me, right? But appeals to things like the past or past behavior, algorithms, dispositions, some kind of external embodiment, and simplicity just don't really seem to be cutting it. We're not answering the skeptic. But again, there must be a solution here. We do communicate. We're doing it right now. We've been doing it for the past hour. So there's got to be some kind of answer. But exactly what it is and exactly how to resolve it, I don't know. But that's why it's fun, right? It's a fun puzzle. It's a fun problem. Because we know there's an answer, we just haven't figured it out yet. That's what keeps us in business. Yeah.
Yeah, so if this is the conclusion, then what is the aversion of most analytical philosophers to use, for instance, Lacan to understand the problems of language?
Well, I guess one of the things here is if we go full Lacanian, we seem to be kind of embracing the upshot of the paradox, that there isn't anything really like meaning. And I take it that the kind of idea expressed by my middle bullet point here, or my third one down, is that there is meaning. There has to be, because we're doing the sort of thing we're doing right now. You asked that question and I responded. So the task is basically, we just don't have an answer yet. And maybe that's eternally, the kind of eternal optimism. So it's a challenge to be met rather than embrace the sort of skeptical, not skeptical solution, but the skeptics throwing your hands up in the air. Maybe another version of this is actually a quote from last week. I think one of the last quotes I had in the slides from last week, we were talking about the negative existentials. And a quote also from Kripke, ironically, that says, at a certain point, I kind of throw my hands up in the air. Right? No, that's one response. Like, fuck it, there is no meaning. All right, let's just move on with our lives. But I don't want to give up. I think there is an answer here. And it seems to me there has to be, again, for this very simple link that Kripke conveyed the paradox to us. We've just talked about it. We talked about how responses might go. We seem to be communicating, expressing meaning. And I don't see how that could work if we embrace the skeptical solution or response. Yeah.
Yeah. So I respect it that I don't agree with that pessimistic disposition of Lacan either, but can we then even explain language by use of language, or must we include a different element that is non-linguistic, non-language? That we can base it on, there must be a non-language element.
So I think this is what the kind of dispositionalist is trying to do, right? So it's not just simply use, how we actually have used things in the past. It's supposed to appeal to something like these intrinsic dispositions. But the problem is, well, the three problems are there. We can make mistakes, so the dispositions can sometimes lead us astray. And we can make sense of that idea. So it can't just be the dispositions. And again, the dispositions only go so far. The finitude problem is not really the exciting one. This is the big one. Even if that is the way we behave, that doesn't justify why we go that way rather than another. It doesn't seem to be a good answer as like, that's the wrong disposition. Why is that the wrong disposition? That's the kind of skeptical challenge we need to meet. So, and no, again, whatever we appeal to, whatever kind of external stuff, if it's additional behavior or some kind of embodiment, whatever, we're going to run something very similar to these problems again. If it's behavior, the finitude problem actually is a big one. If it's something else, then again, the other two are going to have some more bite. So, appealing to external stuff seems like it's going to help, but that's just more stuff to the mill. That could be the kind of machine objection, could be the disposition objection. Problems are going to come up. That's the thought. Maybe we can work it out. Maybe we can find ways around it. There's a really excellent paper. God, what's her name? I just lost it. She's a philosopher of biology at UConn. She has an excellent paper that's something in hoverflies. And it's about an idea where we could have a kind of evolutionary explanation for certain kinds of behavior. And that might be a justification for certain kinds of rule behavior rather than others. So that might be something like that kind of external factors appeal. Cool. Other thoughts about the kind of the rule following paradox? Yeah.
Yeah, but it's more of an administrative question.
Please.
And I don't even know if all my colleagues agree with me, but is it possible that the deadline for the two assignments could be delayed a couple of days because we have a lot of other assignments upcoming this week, and that is the last one?
Let's come back to that after the recording's over.
Okay.
Nice.
So let's just kind of wrap up then. If everyone's okay with moving on, we'll do the last little bit here, and then we can go from there. So yeah, I mean, basically over the course of the lectures, we've covered a bunch of interrelated topics. We spent quite a bit of time focusing on how singular terms work, and the thought there was, look, these are if any part of language is going to be clear and obvious and easy to understand, these should be the simplest. Turns out that's a clusterfuck. We have no idea how even these simple parts of language work. And we talked about Freudian senses, Russell indefinite descriptions, Kripke's kind of neo-Millianism, right? This idea that terms are just rigid designating tags. And we talked about puzzle of belief, this idea that the kind of substitution puzzles that happen with like Lois believes that Kent can fly, Lois believes that Superman can fly, aren't really a problem for any particular view. They're just something really weird. So that was a kind of upshot of our first 4 proper lectures. And then we moved pretty substantively to think about the relationship between something like language and meaning and how we use language. So we talked a little bit about speech acts, and in particular we talked about Langton's argument of speech acts as silencing women, or pornography is a speech act that silences women. And we talked about Grice then, Grice's intentional account of meaning based on this sort of reflexive intention picture, and then his conception of implicature, and this big distinction, or as he purported it, a big difference between something like the pragmatics of an utterance versus the semantics, the content of the utterance. And then the last 2 weeks, what we've done is focused on some kind of applied philosophy of language puzzles. So the stuff on negative existentials and how to make sense of them, and then today, talking on this rule-following paradox. So these are kind of, the rule-following paradox attacks the very broad idea of meaning. Negative existentials kind of shows that there's something weird, even in the very basic kind of claims we use. And generally the aim, if this hasn't been clear, was really to spell out the various puzzles and issues. Long on problems, short on solutions. Story of my life. We've discussed potential solutions, but almost always it's been, yeah, this doesn't work. Now let me stress, every time I've said that kind of thing, I am totally happy if you want to defend one of these solutions, right? And that's me editorializing rather than actually kind of saying, and this is the way it is. Right? That's just my thoughts on the matter here. What I'm interested in is hearing some arguments from you guys, kind of seeing you develop the positions and things like this. You don't have to spit back the crap that I've spit at you. Well, that's not a good phrase, but you see the idea. Right? But let me just stress too, we have barely scratched the surface in terms of philosophy of language topics. This was me kind of picking some fun things I wanted to cover. There are lots more. So if you're interested at all in any of this, please feel free to send me an email. Very happy to talk about it. Thank you guys very much for participating. I hope you enjoyed reading. I'm sure everybody did all the reading, right? Thinking and talking about this stuff. Again, strictly the essays are due, wink, wink, on the 15th of November. Details and suggested topics are on the Canvas page. If you have the time, please fill out the evaluation form if you liked it. I've been Nathan, and this is Philosophy of Language. If you haven't liked it, my name is Alfred Archer. This has been yeah, so thank you guys very much. Woo!